All right, we're on DAF Pei Hey Amid Beis at the bottom. We're at the two dots. The Mishnah had previously told us the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, which was, thank you so much. Rabbi Yehuda's Shita is that as long as you have a tenant of a chatzer where he lives in a domicile that the balabayas stores some of his items, so then because the balabayas has something called the tfisas yad, he has a foothold or a handhold, literally, in the residence of the tenant. The tenant is not considered to be a stakeholder, a legitimate stakeholder in the chutzner to prevent other people from carrying. So if that tenant does not contribute to the ERU, it's not a problem. Since the balabayas is considered to be a stakeholder in his residence, it's almost like the whole thing belongs to the balabas, and therefore you don't need to make an ERU with this guy. So the Gemara's question simply is Heichi dami tfisas yad? What do you mean when you say that he has to have a foothold in the residence? Kagon chatzero shel ben bunyas. The answer is, says the Gemara, would be an illustration would be like the courtyard of Ben Bunyas, who was a very wealthy man and would let other people live in the various residences that were inside his chatzer. And as a result, and he had so much stuff. He was such a wealthy man. He would store so many of his items in these residences that it was not necessary for the people who were his guests to contribute to the Eruv because everything belonged to him. So the Gemara tells us a story that Osa Lakame de Rebbe, that one day this Ben Bunyas came to visit Rebbe, and Omer Lahu Panu Makom LeBen Meyamana. And Rebbe said, make way for this fellow who is a man of 100 manas, so a certain measure of assets. And it's almost like saying, make way for the millionaire, right? So then, Asa Inish Achrina Amr Lahu Panu Makom Leben Masayimana. Another fellow who appeared to be of means came before Rebbe shortly afterwards, and Rebbe said, make way for the multimillionaire. Because Rebbe, based on the appearance of the two gentlemen, looked at the second guy and thought that he was wealthier. But he was making a mistake based on appearances, because sometimes not everything is as it seems. You hear of people who are billionaires. I knew a guy named Dave Gold from Los Angeles, the owner of the 99 cents only stores, who just passed away, and he wore clothes from the 60s, and he drove a car from the 60s. He was a very, very conservative guy, but he died a billionaire. And I knew, and you also know people who will lease a Mercedes so that they can look like they have a lot of money, but when in reality they can barely make their payments on their car, right? So anyway, what happened was Amar Lafan of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Aviv Shalzeh Yeshlo Elef Sfinos Bayam Uchanegdem Elef Ayaros Bayabasha. So Rabbi Shmuel, who was the Talmud of Rebbe, says to Rebbe, he says, you don't realize that Ben Bunyas, that you said make way for the millionaire, he's much wealthier than the second guy. His father has 1,000 boats at sea and 1,000 cities on land. So Amar Lo L'Chishatagia Eitzel Aviv Amar Lo Al Tishagreu B'Kelim Halalu L'Fanai. So Rabbi said back to Rabbi Shmuel, listen, do me a favor. When you run into his father, tell him that next time he sends his son to visit me, he shouldn't send him wearing those clothes, because the clothes have to fit the social status. Okay, so Rebbe Mechabed Ashirim and Rabbi Akiva Mechabed Ashirim. Both Rebbe and Rabbi Akiva used to give tremendous kavod to wealthy people. Why? Not because they were hoping to get a donation, because the great rabbis are above that kind of shmeicheling and shaychad kind of stuff. But rather, it's because they felt that an ashir is worthy of kavod based on the following pasuk. Kedador Ashrava Bar Mari. The pasuk in Tehillim says, Yeshev olam lifnei Elokim, chesed ve'emes man yinseruhu. That the world will endure before God, chesed and emes, kindness and truth, man, which is a word for mizonos, like the word man in the Torah, that sustenance will protect it. So, Emosa yeshev olam lifnei Elokim, bizman shechesed ve'emes man yinseruhu. When does the world endure before God? When you have people in the world who are doing chesed and emes with providing food for other people, that is what protects and holds the world up. And so you see that the whole world endures because of the tzedakah that Ashirim give to Aniyim. And as a result, you have to show special honor and hakaras hatov to the Ashirim of the world who really caused the world to continue.
So why wasn't it qualified, the statement? Rabbi Machabed Shirim, though he's showing some chesed, or this nice, not every wealthy person can give tzedakah.
Well, I guess he assumed that if you're an usher, you're giving tzedakah. What usher, I guess he was
plenty.
The Asherim who weren't giving tzedakah didn't go visit Rabbi.
Probably
No,
not.
but it's a blank statement from Machabed Shirim.
Yeah, because
that's why I understood that the potential maybe of greatness.
Oh, really? I mean, that's possible. That's a possible taich. They have the potentiality for greatness. That's an even better vort, maybe. Okay. Rabba bar Barchana Omar Kagon Yosech Shel Machresha. So getting back to the sugya, Rabba bar Barchana says, how much of a utensil does the balabas have to store in the tenant's house in order for him to have a foothold in the guy's house? Even if it's just the Yosech Shel Macharesha, just the metal sharp part of the plow that is used to till the soil, that's enough of a utensil. Amar Rav Nachman Tana Devei Shmuel Davar Hanitel b'Shabbos Oser Davar Sheinu Nitel b'Shabbos Eino Oser. So Rav Nachman teaches us a big chiddush from the Brisa. The Brisa is basically telling us that the only time that the balabas is considered to have a foothold in the tenant's house is if he has utensils there that are muktzah, that cannot be moved on Shabbos. Because once they're muktzah, you can be assured that they're going to be remaining there the whole Shabbos. But if they're non-muktzah items, then you have to be concerned that they may be vacated on Shabbos by the balabas himself, and therefore he loses his foothold over the course of Shabbos, and therefore he cannot be considered a real occupant of that tenant's house. And therefore the tenant would have to contribute to the eruv. Tanya nami hachi yeshlo tevel yeshlo ashashis v'chol davar shenu nitel b'Shabbos eino aser. The Brisa really reiterates that, and it says that if there's tevel, untithed produce, which is muktzah, or if there's ashashis, which is like scrap metal that is in the tenant's house of the balabas, then the tenant does not have to contribute to the eruv because the balabas is considered to be the sole purveyor of that property. Okay, let's go on to the Mishnah. Hameniach beiso v'holach lishbos be'ir acheres. If a person leaves his house for Shabbos and he goes to stay out of town, he goes to another city for Shabbos. So echad nachri v'echad Yisrael hareza oser divrei Reb Meir. According to Reb Meir, it makes no difference whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. The fact of the matter is that your residence is still in that chutzner, even if you're not there for Shabbos. And if you don't contribute to the eruv, then you preclude everyone else from carrying. But Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, Eino oser. And he says, no, your bodily presence is what precludes others from carrying, and if your body is not there, so then it's not a problem. Just because your house is there, it doesn't count. So basic machlokas Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and then we get Rabbi Yossi, who's the compromise position, and he says, Omer Nachri oser, Yisrael Eino oser. He says it depends. If it's a Gentile who's the guy who's out of town for Shabbos, so then he does preclude others from carrying. The reason being is because he could always come back in the middle of Shabbos. But a Yisrael will not aser, he will not preclude others from carrying. She'ein derech Yisrael lavo b'Shabbos, because it would be very unusual if you've already set up camp out of town. Right, you're spending Shabbos in another city for Shabbos. It would only be under the most extenuating circumstances that you would find yourself back in your residence on Shabbos, and therefore, since that's extremely unlikely, you don't preclude others from carrying. Rabbi Shimon Omer afilu hiniach beisav alach lishbos eitzel bito ba'osa ha'ir eino oser shekvar hisiya milibo. And Rabbi Shimon says a further kula. And he says, no, he says you don't have to be out of town. You could even be in the same town, in a different chutzner, a different mavoi, whatever. You still don't preclude your neighbors from carrying because you've already removed your residence from your mind. You're in another place for Shabbos. So if you go to your daughter's house for Shabbos and she lives in another part of town, like let's say she lives down by Bathurst and Lawrence, you go to your daughter's house, that's perfectly fine, and you don't preclude the members of your chutzner here from carrying. So now the Gemara says something very, very, very profound. Amar Rav halacha karib Shimon. The halacha is like Reb Shimon v'davka bito, but it's only if you're going to your daughter for Shabbos. Avol bino lo. But if you're going to your son for Shabbos and his wife, then you may end up back in your house at some point on Shabbos. Why? Because the Amri Inshi, Navach Bach Kalba Ol, Navach Bach Guryasa Pok, that, as people say, the phrase is that if the male dog barks at you, then that's a sign you can come in and are welcome. Meaning, if your son-in-law says, "Come on, Pop, come on, Tati, come over for Shabbos," you know that you're welcome. But if your daughter-in-law calls you, the female dog calls you, and says, "Come over for Shabbos," then there's no guarantee you're going to end up making it through Shabbos. so you have to be careful. So, and therefore you're not, as long as you're in the same town, you do preclude the other members of your chutzner from carrying, because you never know. You may say something about her cooking, and then she's going to say, "You're out of here," and then you're going to have to go back to your chutzner.
Wait, but it said dafka bito. Only if his daughter invites him?
Right. Daughter meaning your son-in-law. Your son.
As opposed to your daughter-in-law?
As opposed that if it's your son that invites you for Shabbos,
your daughter-in-law might kick you out.
Your daughter-in-law might kick you out.
He's not married, he doesn't understand these things.
Would Rabbi Shimon distinguish between a goy and a Yisrael? Like, is he building off Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi? No, yeah.
He's Makel. Reb Shimon is saying that as long as you've precluded yourself from your residence on Shabbos, even in Yisrael, so he seems to be going like Rabbi Yehuda, that even a Yisrael is considered to be out of town, even if you're in the same city.
Or maybe a Nachri, meaning a Nachri doesn't go away for Shabbos and go and say, like, "I'm gone for the whole Shabbos." He could come back.
A Nachri could always come back, so you don't really see from Reb Shimon what he holds by a Nachri. That's true, you don't see. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Bor shebein shtei chatzeros ein mamalan mimenu b'Shabbos ele im kein asu lo mechitza gavoa asar tvachim. So now, switching gears completely, you have a bore, a ditch that's filled with water. We'll call it a reservoir. You have a reservoir that is between two chatzeros. And the two chatzeros did not make an eruv with each other, so you can't draw. Neither side can draw water from the reservoir unless they make a wall that is 10 tfachim high. And as we'll see, according to the Tanakama, the wall actually has to be inserted into the recess of the reservoir in order for it to be considered to be a partition. The partition has to be inside the bore. It has to be inside the reservoir.
Bottom of the bore?
Well, we'll see. That's not so clear. Bein milamata, bein mitoch ogno. And it doesn't make a difference whether it goes to the bottom of the reservoir or whether it is just up to the lip of the reservoir. As long as it's inside the reservoir and it's 10 tfachim high, it makes no difference how it's positioned. However, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, he says no, that this is a machlokes as to how to position the partition. Beis Shammai Omer milamata, uBeis Hillel Omer milamala. Beis Shammai say it has to be on the bottom, and Beis Hillel say that it can be on the top. Now, what bottom and top means is going to be the subject of controversy. We'll see that momentarily. Amar Reb Yehuda lotei mechitza gedola min hakaisel shebineihem. And Reb Yehuda is completely makel, and he says, no, you don't need a wall to go inside the reservoir as long as it's an extension of the already existing wall on both sides of the reservoir which divide the mechitza. It could be completely above ground and just be a continuation of a regular wall that runs across the mechitza, and therefore you don't need to put anything inside the reservoir. As long as it goes over the reservoir, that's perfectly fine.
Are they supposing that the wall was already there and just how to include the cistern or the reservoir? Or are they saying if there were no wall...
There is no wall inside the reservoir currently. In order for you to be able to draw water from it, there's a machlokus is what accommodation you have to make inside the reservoir. So the Tanakama says you have to put in a 10 mechitza, vertically high mechitza, and it makes no difference whether it's on the bottom or on top, as long as it's inside the reservoir. Shimon Gamliel says it's a machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel how to position the mechitza, and Rabbi Yehuda says as long as you have a wall over the top of the reservoir, which is already part of an existing wall that already divides the two, then you don't have to do anything else.
But isn't that counterintuitive? If there's no wall, that means we're sharing. If there is a wall, that means this is mine, this is yours. Now we have to make an arrangement. Why make an arrangement? Just say it belongs, it's common.
But they didn't make an eruv. They didn't make an eruv. That's the problem. The two chutzers did not incorporate their domain. So therefore, they're not. It's a shared domain that is not eruv. That was not eruv. That was not incorporated. and therefore they can't transfer from it. It's a Carmelis. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna, lamata mamish, lamaila mamish. So Rav Huna says that when you want to define what the machlokus between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is according to Shimon Gamliel, when Beis Shammai says it has to be lamata, it means it has to be mamish lamata. Now there are different ways of explaining that, but the way Rashi explains it, and it seems the way Tosfos explains it as well, is it has to go down to the water line. Meaning, let's say you have a reservoir where the water is, let's say, only halfway up the reservoir. So the mechitza has to go down to until it's at the very top of the water line. And lamaila, according to which is what Beis Hillel advocates, is that the mechitza only has to start from the top of the recess of the reservoir, but it doesn't have to go down to the water line. That's the opinion of Rav Huna. And Rav Yehuda Amar, lamata min hamayim, lamaila min hamayim. And Rav Yehuda disagrees, and he says that when we say lamata, it means it has to go beneath the water level. That the mechitza has to be inserted inside the water, and lamaila means lamaila min hamayim, and the above, according to Beis Hillel, means that it can be above the water line, but it has to go all the way down to the water line. So when you analyze it, it turns out that the opinion, according to Rav Huna, the lamata of Beis Shammai is equivalent to Rav Yehuda's lamaila of Beis Hillel, meaning that according to Rav Huna, lamata means that it's going down to the water line, and according to Rav Yehuda, lamaila of Beis Hillel means it's also going down to the water line, but it's above the water line. And therefore, it's a very important machlokes. So there's actually a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos as far as, according to Beis Shammai, how far down does the mechitza have to go according to Beis Shammai. I'm going to be learning, like Tosfos for simplicity, that we're dealing all the time with a 10 tfachim high vertical wall, partition that you put in, and according to Beis Shammai, as long as it's completely immersed in the water, it's fine. It doesn't have to go all the way down to the bottom.
There's no mechitza above ground? Or there is?
There's no mechitza above ground necessarily at all. Yes.
This diagram shows a mechitza above ground.
Well, there's a wall. There's a wall anyway. So
that's not significant.
No. There's a lot of ways of learning this sugya. You're going to have to stick with me or stick with Art Scroll. Amar le Rabba bar Rav Chanan le Abaye. Ad Amar Rav Yehuda lamata min hamayim. So according to Rav Yehuda, who says that he's the more machmir, and he says that according to Beis Shammai, the partition has to be immersed in the water completely. Ma'ishna lamata mamish delo da arivi maya. Lamata min hamayim nami ha'arivi maya. So why does he hold that when Beis Shammai say that it means lamata, that it has to be completely immersed? Because if it wasn't completely immersed in the water, then the waters would mix. Mm-hmm. But even when you have a partition that's completely immersed in the water is still going to invariably mix, because sometimes the bottom of the reservoir is very, very deep, and so a mechitza of 10 tfachim is not going to cut it. So Amar Lei lo shami ala chada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav umatu ba mishum Rabbi Chia tzarach sheyirau roshan shalkanim l'mayla min hamayim tefach. So he says, obviously you didn't hear what was stated in the name of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, who says that the mechitza actually has to protrude above the waterline, according to Beis Shammai, 1 tefach. So this is where you have this machlokas Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi says that what this statement is that the mechitza taka has to go all the way down to the bottom, but Tosfos says no. Tosfos says that we're still dealing with a 10 tefach high partition, and the only thing that is required is not that the water be completely separated, because that's not practical. You can't separate water. You just have to demarcate that there is a separation. I require that the majority of the partition be immersed in the water, and a portion of it be visible from above the waterline so that people can see that you've made a physical demarcation. That's the requirement according to Rav Yehuda's understanding of Beis Shammai. V'su hada amar Rav Yehuda l'mayla min hamayim ma'ishna l'mayla mamish delo da arivi maya l'mayla min hamayim nami ha'arivi maya. Now let's talk about Rav Yehuda further when it comes to Beis Hillel Shita. when you told me that according to Beis Hillel it has to be above, why did he say that it can't be that the definition of above is not in relation to the reservoir itself, but rather in relation to the water? He defines above meaning above the water line, and not just above meaning going up to the very, very top of the reservoir. But what compelled him to explain it that way? Why? Because he was concerned about the water mixing with each other. Even if the plank of partition is above the water line, the water is still going to be mixed below it. So the Gemara says, Amrlei lo shamiya lachadetani Yaakov karchina tzarach sheyishka rashi kanim b'mayim tefach. So he says, obviously you didn't hear what the teaching of Rabbi Yaakov Karchina is, that even according to, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Beis Hillel, the plank, the mechitza, has to be partially immersed in the water, meaning that when he says Lamaila, it's just that the majority of the plank, 9 tefachim out of 10, can be above the water line, but 1 tefach has to be immersed in the water. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even Beis Hillel agrees that there has to be some physical demarcation of separation within the water itself, according to Beis Hillel. And that's why he says that Lamaila can't be completely elevated above the water. It has to be touching the water and partially into the water. And that's why he defines Lamaila as Lamaila min hamayim. So the Gemara now says, Ve'elahada Amar Rav Yehuda, Kora Arba'a Materes B'churva, that, and V'Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravuha, Kora Arba'a Materes B'mayim. So we're going to discuss this using a principle called Gud Achis, using a principle of that you look at something that is above as if there's an imaginary line that brings it all the way down. Now, normally we say this by a vertical wall. We say Gud Achis Mechitzta in a number of different situations. When you have a vertical wall that is suspended, we say that you imagine the wall going all the way down to the very depths, to the ground or even below ground when necessary. That's the position according to most Shittas. However, there is another Tana who we don't paskin like, says Rashi, that Rav Yehuda subscribes to. And that Tana says that even when you have a horizontal plank that is resting on an open ceiling, let's say you're inside a churva, you're inside a ruin, where you only have walls and you have no ceiling, but you have a plank of wood that runs across the rooftop. Since you have this plank is 4 tefachim wide, it can be very, very thin, but it's 4 tefachim wide. We say that according to at least one Tana, Rav Yehuda says, you can imagine that this plank forms imaginary walls on either side of the plank, and therefore you'd be allowed to carry inside while you're walking underneath this plank. And Rav Nachman says that principle of a Korah acting as creating imaginary walls is true, but it's only true over a body of water. It's not true over dry land. And so therefore the question is, HaKa'azil Deli Li'idach Gisa. The question is, even if you say that this plank works, what about the fact that the bucket, that each side, so according to this Shita, you'd be allowed to put a plank over the top of a bore, and that would be sufficient to create a separation between the two chutzers to allow each chutzer to draw water from the well. The question, however, is, according to this opinion, why shouldn't you be concerned that the bucket that you're using to draw the water is going to drift over to the other side? When you attach a bucket to a string, you should be concerned that it's going to drift to the other side, and then you're really going to have problems because you're mamish all the way into the other chutzer. So the Gemara says, Kim lahula rabbanan de'ein deli mahalach yoser me'arba'a tfachim, that the rabbis made a fairly reasonable assumption that when you attach a string to a bucket, you're not going to allow it to travel more than 4 tfachim away from you, and therefore you don't have to worry that it's going to drift all the way to the other side. But the Gemara says, Tachas Korah miha ha'irvimayim. But the Gemara says, but at least when the bucket goes underneath this beam, fine, it acts as a partition from a halachic standpoint, but what about the fact that the water is mixed with the water of the other chatzir? and you're drawing water from the other chatzar. So the Gemara says, Ela mishum dekalhu she'ikilu chachamim b'mayim. There's a special kula that the chachamim made with water that we allow you to imagine a wall that is suspended to go all the way down. And therefore, as long as you are staying within the confines of the plank, then we imagine that there is an imaginary wall at the edge of the plank that separates you from the other side of the bore. And that's only a leniency that the rabbis allowed for when it comes to bodies of water. Kidaba mine Rabbi Tavla merav mechitza tluya mahu shetater b'churva amar lei ein mechitza tluya materes ela b'mayim kalu shekilu chachamim b'mayim. And this was a question that Rabbi Tavla had asked of Rav. Does a mechitza tluya, does a suspended wall allow you to create a valid halachic wall in a ruin on dry land? And his response to him was, no, that's not a duly constituted wall halachically, because the only time that a suspended wall that's above ground, that is suspended above ground, acts as a valid wall for the purposes of carrying is only when it's a wall that is over bodies of water. And if you'll recall, this was the mechitza tluya that we had seen a couple days ago when we talked about that box that is on the side of your apartment that is on lakefront property, where we said that you can drop a bucket through that box, the bottomless box, to draw water. Because we say that the box, we imagine, is going all the way down to the bottom of the lake, and therefore you've created a reshus hayachid within the space of this mechitza tluya, within the space of this confinement. Okay, but it only works over bodies of water. So therefore the Gemara wants to suggest as follows. Any kind of discussion that we have about creating a mechitza, there's never a requirement for the mechitza to go all the way down to the bottom of the reservoir. Because no matter how you're going to learn, everyone agrees, whether you rely on the leniency of a plank creating imaginary walls or not, everyone agrees that when you have a wall that is a vertically assembled wall, doesn't have to go all the way down to the bottom, because there's a special leniency that the rabbis created when it comes to water. Amar Rabbi Yehuda lo tehei mechitza. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't even require that there has to be a specially constructed mechitza for the reservoir itself. As long as there's a wall that runs from one side of the chutzner to the other and runs over the top of the bore, that's enough of a divider for me. Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda b'shitas Rabbi Yossi Amra, da Amar mechitza tuluya materes afilu beyabasha. That Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to the shita of Rabbi Yossi, who says that a mechitza tuluya, a suspended wall, an above ground wall, works even on dry land. Now what's the connection? Rashi says the very fact that Rabbi Yehuda does not require me to assemble a special wall over the water, but says that this can be a continuation of the regular wall that divides between the two chutzers, indicates that he doesn't require a special accommodation or a special halacha for water. It could be the same wall that is over the rest of the chutzer, and that's all that you need. So therefore, even though this is a mechitza tuluya that is over water, but it's really considered to be a dry land mechitza vis-a-vis this reservoir, because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require any additional accommodation. And so that indicates to us that he holds that a mechitza tuluya over dry land is going to work, not like we had just said a moment ago. And therefore the Gemara wants to suggest that this is the basis of the machlokes. So the Gemara says, and where do we see that Rabbi Yossi holds this shita? We'll see in just a minute. Ditnan hamashal shel defanos milamala lamata. That if here the Mishnah is talking about the law of making a sukkah. And when it comes to making a sukkah, that if you hang a wall starting from the ceiling going down to the ground, so then bisman shegavohos min haaretz gimel tfachim pesula, that if the wall does not hit within 3 tfachim of the ground, then it's not a kosher sukkah wall. And mimata l'mayla, but if you're building the wall from the ground going up, so im gavohos yud tfachim keshera. As long as the wall is 10 tfachim high, even if it doesn't reach all the way up to the schach, it's still a kosher sukkah. And that's taka how we paskin. Rabbi Yossi Omer, but Rabbi Yossi is more lenient, and he says, Kishem shemi lamata lamala asara, kach milamala lamata asara. And Rabbi Yossi says that just like you can have a wall from the bottom up that's 10 tvachim high, so too you can have a wall that is hung from the ceiling going downwards that's 10 tvachim high, and we don't require it to hit the ground because we say the principle of good achis mechitzta, and we allow the wall to imagine the wall going down all the way to the floor.
We don't hold like Rabbi Yossi.
We do not hold like Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, at least we see that Rabbi Yossi holds that you can have a mechitza teluya even on dry land. But the Gemara says, Velohi, lo Rabbi Yehuda sarvala ka Rabbi Yossi, velo Rabbi Yossi sarvala ka Rabbi Yehuda. But the Gemara says that that's incorrect. It is not that you can line up the shittas of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi because they're talking about apples and oranges. Rabbi Yehuda lo sarvala ka Rabbi Yossi, because adkan lo kama Rabbi Yehuda ela be'eru ve'chatzeros derabanan. Aval sukkah de'oraisa lo. He says because Rabbi Yehuda is talking only about eruv chatzeros, which is a rabbinic law. Maybe only over there is Rabbi Yehuda liberal to say that you can have a mechitza teluya that goes over dry land. But what about the sukkah? Sukkah is a mitzvah saseh deoraisa. It's a biblical law. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda was not prepared to be lenient when it comes to biblical halacha. And furthermore, I could say the other direction. V'lo Rabbi Yossi sarvala ka Rabbi Yehuda, because adkan lo kama Rabbi Yossi ela b'sukkah disur asehu. Avol Shabbos disur skilahu lo amar. Let's go the other direction now. Maybe Rabbi Yossi is only lenient to allow a mechitza teluya on dry land when it comes to a sukkah, which is only, even though, albeit a biblical law, but it's only a mitzvah saseh, that it's only a positive commandment. Basukos teish v'shivas yomim. You don't get kares if you don't sit in the sukkah. You certainly don't get the death penalty if you don't sit in the sukkah. And maybe that's why Rabbi Yossi is liberal and says that you can have a mechitza teluya. But when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, I will grant you that this particular halacha of Shabbos is a rabbinic law, that you need to have a mechitza between the two chatzers in order to be able to carry and in order to be able to draw water. But nevertheless, when the rabbis instituted rabbinic law, they fashioned it after the biblical laws of Shabbos, which involve an Isser Deoraisa and a death penalty. So maybe there's more reason to be machmir by the laws of Shabbos than there is to be the laws of Sukkah. So therefore, you can't adduce from the case of Sukkah to the case of Shabbos or vice versa. V'im tomar oso ma'aser shenasa b'tzipori al pi minasa lo al pi Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, but then wait a minute. If you're going to argue that Rabbi Yossi himself is only liberal about a mechitza teluya by Sukkah, but not for the laws of Shabbos, we know that Rabbi Yossi was the Mora Da'asra of the city of Tzipori. And we know that there was a case where they permitted a mechitza teluya on Shabbos. So wasn't it Rabbi Yossi who permitted it? So doesn't that prove that Rabbi Yossi is liberal not only by Sukkah but also by Shabbos? So the Gemara says, no, it wasn't paskined by Rabbi Yossi. It was Ella Alpi Rabbi Yishmael by Rabbi Yossi Nasa. It was paskined by Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi's son. Rabbi Yossi was already nifter at the time when this Maisa happened, and we don't know what he would have paskined. But Rabbi Yishmael, his son, was liberal and permitted even a mechitza teluya for the laws of Shabbos. Now, what was the Maisa? There was once a Maisa as follows. There was a Chatzer, and there were multiple residents of the Chatzer, and one of the residents had a Sefer Torah in his house. Another doorway that opened up into this Chatzer was the synagogue, was the Beis HaKnesses, was the shul. And they normally would bring, before Shabbos, they would transfer the Sefer Torah from the Balabas's house into the shul. This particular Shabbos, they forgot to transfer the Sefer Torah before Shabbos, and Lamachar Parsu Sadin al Hamudim Eviu Sefer Torah v'Karubo. So what did they do the next day? They had an idea. They saw some stakes rising from the ground that would divide this particular Balabayas' house from all the other houses, and it would create a sequestration to that only this Balabayas' house was within within these stakes in the ground connected to the synagogue. So they put a sheet over those stakes, and they created a mechitza teluya. They created this suspended wall, temporary suspended wall, and they allowed the balabas to carry the Sefer Torah from his house to the shul. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, how could that be? Parsu lechatchila mishari. Since when is it permitted to create this wall on Shabbos? Everyone agrees that you can't make even a temporary tent or partition on Shabbos. So elamatsu sadinin prusim al ha'amudim ve'eviu sefer Torah v'korbo. But rather, what happened is that they discovered, like let's say a woman had hung her laundry up to dry, and the laundry line went straight down the middle of the chutzner, such that the sheets were actually had already created a partition to divide this balabas from the other balabatim in the chutzner, and therefore they permitted him, because it was there from before Shabbos, they permitted him to carry. But the point is, the sheets didn't come down to the ground. So you see that whoever permitted that must have held that a mechitza tluya is permitted even when it's on dry land. Fine. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya amru davar echad. The Gemara now says another point, and that is Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you're allowed to make a mechitza tluya of this fashion to allow you to have a wall that goes over the bore, and say that that wall is considered to be going all the way downwards. You see how liberal he is when it comes to creating a partition in a body of water. He holds like a similar liberal position, which is the position of Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. Now, what is that? Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya Omer. I'm sorry. They say Amru Davar Echad. Rabbi Yehuda Hada Amran. So Rabbi Yehuda is, like we said, that he says that as long as there's already an existing wall that runs over the board to divide the two chutzers anyway, you can use that to divide the bore also and to draw water from either side. But Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya, what is that? The Tanya, Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya Omer, Gezus Tera sheyesh ba arba amos al arba amos, chokek ba dalet al dalet umimale. So just now, here's where a diagram is very helpful. When you have, we learned about a gazustra before. A gazustra is basically a plank, right? And you take a plank, you take your two L braces, and you attach it to the outside of a building. Okay? Here we're dealing with a building that is a lakefront property, and you can many times use this gazustra, like we learned before, to be able to draw water. The only thing is that previously we had created this necessity of attaching to the bottom of this plank. Then it's necessary to create this bottomless box, which is 10 tfachim high and 4 by 4 tfachim. That creates a mechitza teluya. It creates your walls, so to speak, that we imagine going all the way down to the bottom of the lake, and therefore it creates a reshus hayachid beneath this mechitza teluya, beneath this box. And therefore you can throw your bucket that's attached to a string through the hole in the plank, and then it goes through the box, and it goes down into the water, and you can draw water that way. Rabbi Chananya says an even greater chiddush. He says you don't need a box. As long as the plank, the horizontal plank that's attached to the side of the apartment building, is 4 by 4 amos, then you have a way of doing it without creating a vertical mechitza, a vertical box, going downwards below the plank. How is that? He says, just cut a hole in the very center of the plank that's a square of 4 by 4 tfachim. Now think about it for a second. 4 amos, how many tfachim is that? 24. It's 24 tfachim, because an amma is 6 tfachim. So if you have a 4 amma long 4 by 4, then it's 24 by 24 tfachim. If you cut a hole of 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim in the center, then how many tfachim do you have going in all directions? 10 tfachim on all sides. So listen to what he says. He says, not only are you able to imagine that the wall goes all the way down from the hole, but you can imagine also the plank being bent over 90 degrees on all sides, such that you have 10 tfachim going downwards instead of 10 tfachim going out horizontally. It's almost like if you would purchase, you ever purchase moving boxes, corrugated boxes from the store? They come flat, and you fold them out. So he's basically saying that it's like a corrugated box that you buy flat, and you can imagine it as being bent like that.
This is non-Euclidean geometry.
Non-Euclidean geometry. It's basically very imaginative geometry, but basically he's prepared to be so makel as to say that even when the 10 tfachim is horizontal, you can imagine it as being vertical and creating the mechitza teluya. So basically, the Gemara is basically suggesting as follows, that Rabbi Yehuda has this very vivid imagination of a wall that's even above a bore going downwards. So presumably, Rabbi Akavio has the very same vivid kind of imagination as imagining a completely horizontal plank as being vertical and allowing you to draw water that way is also, they're aligned in that sense. The Amar Le Abaya says not necessarily. Dilma Lohi, Ad Kan Lo Ka'amar Rabbi Yehuda Hasam Ela Da Amar Gud Achis Mechitzta, Aval Kof V'Gud Lo. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda is only liberal to say that when you have a wall that's above a bore, you can say that you imagine the wall going all the way down to the bottom of the lake or the bottom of the reservoir. But to say that he's also going to be so liberal as to say that you can imagine bending a horizontal plank and making it vertical, that he never says. That you never see that Rabbi Yehuda is so liberal. And furthermore, maybe Rabbi Chananya would not agree to Rabbi Yehuda because Ad Kan Lo Kama Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya Hasam Ela Biyama Shel Tveria Ho V'yesh La Ognayim V'ayaros V'karfefos Mekifos Osa Aval Bishar Memos Lo. And furthermore, maybe Rabbi Chananya was only lenient in the specific case where he said that this will work, which was in the Yama Shel Tveria with the lake Tveria, right? Which was what? Probably the Yam Kinneret. Why? Because there, first of all, the river banks were extremely distinct and clear. Second of all, there was a whole yishuv that was built around it. So therefore, it was very clearly demarcated that this was an inhabited area. And it was very lushly inhabited all around the body of water. And that's why he was so liberal to say that even though it's really a Carmelis, but it's a Carmelis that is very close to being a place of habitation, and therefore we can be liberal and allow you to draw water this way. But in a scenario where it's just two people, maybe he wouldn't, where there was not as much demarcation that there's not as much demarcation of habitation. Maybe he wasn't so prepared to be makel. He was only makel in a place where you had a lot of demarcation, that it's like there's walls all around this body of water. There's high lake banks rather. There's lots of houses around it, and that in itself forms a type of wall around this lake, and that's why he was prepared to be makel. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.